Simple Ike's gal, or so the folks of Tucker Cove called her. Not unkindly, though, for nobody thought unkindly of Maybelle Gabby, nor of her father for that matter. Ike Gabby wasn't to blame for being simple. Some folks were just born that way. To be sure, there was a difference of opinion in Tucker's Cove as to whether Ike Gabby was simple or not. Mountain folks didn't have the yardsticks for measuring the human mind as the glib professors of education have nowadays. In Tucker's Cove, they would just look at a fella and listen to him talk and form their own opinion as to how much brains or book sense God Almighty gave him. As far as looks went, Ike Gabby's were against him. The short stretch of forehead between his black foretop and his bushy eyebrows certainly didn't suggest a giant intellect, nor was his talk any more in favor than his looks. His tongue and his lips struggled hard with vowels and consonants, and his stuttering speech was scarcely intelligible. Everybody knew, too, that despite several terms of schooling, Ike had never so much learned his letters. The gawky boy, with his perpetual grin, had sputtered at the back of class after class in the Possum Trot School. He was the despair of his teachers and the source of perennial laughter of all the other children. Then came Noah Dilrod, the new professor at Possum Trot. Now Noah, he had all the qualifications of a good schoolmaster, except the minor ones such as scholarship, common sense, sympathy, and an understanding of children. The essentials that he had in abundance: a powerful frame, a raucous voice, a domineering manner, and pull with the district's directors. He kept school in Tucker's Cove for 2 dreary decades. However, the new professor only endured Ike Gabby's pathetic efforts for 3 short days. In that time, he had psychoanalyzed the lad, even though that fine new word hadn't been invented at the time. But on the 3rd and final day, Mr. Dilrod brought down a heavy-handed palm down upon Ike's desk with a bang that made every tiny lad in the class hold their breath in fear. "Pick up your books, big boy, and get for home. If the good Lord had meant for you to get an education, He'd have gave you the brains to get it with. Now I've watched you for 3 days, and I can tell you ain't got no book sense at all. There ain't a teacher in the whole state of Virginia that can teach a student like you." The children winced, partly in terror and partly for pity. But Ike Gabby, he just grinned. Slowly he gathered up his battered speller, his primer, and his chalk slate, and he rose to go. "Yeah, there, Professor, you're right," he mumbled as plainly as his clumsy mouth could admit the words. I know something's the matter with me. I was just born that way." And a grin exploded into a crackle that made the children burst into laughter as the ungainly boy slipped out the door. Just like that, thus ended the academic career of Ike Gabby. Never again were his poor eyes to be mocked and tortured by the cruel, cryptic symbols of science and reading and writing and arithmetic. Letters and figures and books just wasn't for him. From that day forward, he belonged to the great world of the outdoors. Ike could understand the big elemental things of the world. Things like hills and trees and rocks and cattle. Those were made for such eyes as his. These things made perfect sense. Especially cattle, cows and calves, beef steers and draft oxen. These were the things he could make sense of. He never grew tired of tending to them on the range. On his father's rocky hillside farm, there was a fair size of cattle on it. And there, they needed a husky fellow like Ike to mend fences, to carry salt to the licks on the grassy hills, and every now and then to take the dogs and chase a bear back into the deep woods. Shortly after Ike's retirement from Noah Dilford School, he lost both his parents to the fever, and he was left as an orphan, with the farm and a bunch of yearlings out on the pasture. All the neighbors wondered how Ike would ever manage to fend for himself, but somehow he seemed to get along. In fact, he soon showed signs of becoming what his father had aspired to be, but never was, and that's a natural-born trader. Now, while it was hard to understand his mumbling jargon when he would talk to a neighbor, he would sooner or later make it clear that he was wanting to buy or sell or swap a cow or a beef critter. And even the canniest Scotch-Irish hillsman in the cove had to admit that Ike could dicker and bargain as shrewdly as the best of them. "Simple Ike, he sure knows those beasts," was the usual comment. "You can't fool him on nothing that goes around on hooves." Before long, Ike had the best stock cattle range in the county. He was patient, industrious, and he possessed an almost uncanny judgment and trading sense that made him the pride and the envy of Tucker's Cove. Never once did he ever question the verdict that was pronounced upon him years earlier by the professor, Mr. Dilrod. All he was fit for was to stick on the farm, raise calves, fatten them, sell them, and buy more calves. In Ike's mind, most anybody could do that, he figured. About this time, two newcomers, Polly Judson and her father, moved into Tucker's Cove, and Polly was pretty enough to be restful to the eyes of any man. She had sense, too. She had gone through high school and taken a course in business at the college in Crockettsburg. That's right, she was keeping books for a racket store with her father when one day he felt the call of the hills and he bought the farm adjoining Ike Gabby's. Polly started to raise chickens and ducks and turkeys to help keep life in Tucker's Cove from being intolerable. She even bought a calf or two from Ike Gabby. She found him to be the friendly sort, a good neighbor, after she finally learned to understand his labored speech. In his awkward way, he taught her the things she needed to know: how to judge, buy, condition, and market calves. He told her what to do when a steer was sick or when a bossy needed to be weaned. Every week, she needed his advice for something, and he gladly offered his help. Now, Polly Judson, she was human and lonely. While Crockettsburg had only been a village, Tucker's Cove was a barren island of loneliness and a vast ocean of billowy blue solitude. Gradually, she grew more gratefully aware of the big, honest, kindly soul of her one true neighbor, and she became more strangely blind to his exterior. She preferred to judge Ike by who he was on the inside. Now, when they were married, folks in Tucker's Cove chuckled a bit, but they took it philosophically. "Ike's out-married himself," people said. "He sure got himself a looker." "Yeah, but then again, she might have done a heap worse," another would argue. "Ike ain't no scholar or pretty man, but he's well fixed with money, and he'll be good to his woman." Polly made a dutiful and diligent mistress of the old Gabby homestead, the rambling log house which kept as clean as soap, water, and scouring sand could make it. The cattle business thrived, multiplied, and brought in good prices. Polly had a hankering for pretty things, a taste that was remarkably fine for one in her situation. But Ike was generous, and he provided the fixes as willingly as ever. Polly put a touch of beauty on everything in their home, and she loved her man. Soon, Polly was pregnant, and she spent hours of anxiety and foreboding before the year was out. What would her little one look like? Would his eyes be straight, his head well formed? Would he stand among other men, shapely and good to look upon? After all, what mother never hoped that her son would be handsome? The night Maybelle was born, Polly was consumed with anguish, and a strange fear clutched at her heart, a fear that she couldn't even disclose, not even to her husband. Even when the toothless midwife held the babe close for the young mother's first look and declared, "It's as pretty as a gal as I've ever seen born," Polly wasn't quite trustful of the dim light of the kerosene lamp. She agonized till the full light of day broke, and then she tremblingly drew back the cover to reveal the tiny head that nestled in the hollow of her arm. It was true, every bit of it. Her daughter, Ike Gabby's daughter, was without spot or blemish. She was nearly perfect in trunk, limbs, and head, as any Madonna could have yearned for. Oh, the ageless miracle of chromosomes. Out of the millions of possible combinations, lovely or hideous, in the eternal lottery of destiny, which the scholars now call heredity, there had been shaken together as far and harmonious an assortment as ever falls into the lap of daughters of men. With a sigh that was almost a moan, so surcharged it was with relief, and by the sheer joy of new motherhood, Polly sank back onto the pillow, and she sobbed herself into blissful sleep. Despite her joy, however, a joy that was to grow with the passing weeks and years, Polly herself was never to know full health again. It was all she could do was to drag herself about the house, care for her child, and give occasional attention to the flowers and the chickens. Ike was good, though, and there was always a hired woman in the kitchen, so that Polly could spend most of her time setting, and very busy setting it was. To be sure, Maybelle had all the care any baby could need. Polly did 100 things that other mountain women had no time to do for their offspring. With just the right touch of guidance, she directed Maybelle's first steps, her first words, her play, and her happy burst of song. And every day she read to her. Polly had 3 whole shelves of books, more books than Tucker Cove folk had ever seen in one house. I mean, why would anyone be bothered with such a mess of books? Too many books, they said. Nobody could read that much and be healthy. If Miss Gabby would leave them books alone and get out there in the field with a hoe, she'd be a heap more stouter today, the old wise women figured. And besides, she's going to spoil that young'un too. That young gal ought to have a hand in the corn harvest or helping with the tobacco, instead of sitting and listening to so much plumb foolishness out of those books. Nevertheless, Maybelle grew up sturdy, brown-legged, clear-eyed, vibrant, and just a bubbling of life. Her daddy grinned with delight at her childish ways. He would listen to Polly reading in the evenings as he dumbly comprehended some of the simpler words, but he would never interrupt to ask questions about what he didn't understand. For Ike, as long as Maybelle understood, that was good enough. And it looked like she was going to grow up smart like her mom, and that was his only hope in life. A day came when strange things happened in Possum Trot School. The drab one-room shack was abandoned, and a new 6-room building rose further down in the valley. The Cove people, they grumbled at the extravagance of putting good tax money into such costly structures just to teach youngins. But the building was there, and there was nothing they could do about it. However, strangest of all, Noah Dilrod was not the professor in the new school. Rumor had it that he had failed to secure the necessary certificate, and therefore he couldn't teach anymore. Oh, it seemed a shame and a pity. Noah had a big family, and he needed the money. Moreover, his arm was just as strong as ever, and his voice could still inspire terror in all the kids. It's better to left well enough alone, folks figured. Dilrod's successor called himself the principal. He was a dapper young man with a virginal mustache and a diploma from a state college. His 5 assistants were young women. They were the first of their sex ever employed in Tucker's Cove. How they hoped to render bridle-wise and untamed human colts and the fillies of the settlement, the old ones couldn't figure out. It takes a heap more book learning and a sheepskin from a college to beat common sense into the young'uns nowadays. Despite the doubts of the mountain folks, however, the new principal, Mr. Adolphus Langston, and his fair colleagues got the school underway in short order. Soon, the old rule of the hickory stick gave way to the regime of orthodox methodology. Just like that, all the procedures of the past were as extinct as a 5-toed horse. These new teachers, they talked about retardation and acceleration, mean and median, upper and lower quartile, intelligence quotient, and much else that would have been Greek to Noah Dilrod and Hebrew to Ike Gabby and his neighbors. But that young staff was dead set in earnest, and they pored nightly over books and notebooks. Finally, Mabel was 7 years old, and school was to begin tomorrow. Her daddy had already bought her first reader, a writing tablet, and a striped pencil box. The next morning, though, her mother was sick, sicker than she'd ever been. Ike sent for a doctor, who made it by horseback toward the evening. The doctor said she ought to be in a hospital, but she was too ill to make the journey. And so it was. Maybelle couldn't make the first day of school, and the next day, Polly was even worse. She lingered for 3 weeks, and on a Sunday, she died. When Maybelle was finally ready to go to school, she was a whole month late. Finally, the day came, and Ike brought her to school for the first time. For years, he had looked forward to the day when he could lead his daughter to enter in triumph the portals from which he had emerged in defeat. He wanted to prove that a Gabby could indeed learn those baffling ABCs, and that would be the proudest achievement of his life. It would be worth more to him than 100 fat steers. The principal, Mr. Adolphus Langston, met him at the entrance. The grizzled father and the shrinking child followed him through the door. and stood embarrassed outside his office. "A new pupil to enter the school?" the principal asked briskly. "Pretty late, I fear, but fill out this registration card for her." Ike shook his head and he struggled to explain his desire to become a patron of the school and that he would like to donate some money to purchase some new books for the children. After the principal listened to Ike, it was plain enough to him to see that this fella didn't know what he was talking about at all. He proceeded to ignore Ike, and he addressed himself to the girl directly. The principal spouted off a string of questions, without ever pausing for Maybelles' answer. "What is your name? Address?" "Why, that means where you live, of course. Have you ever attended school before?" "You believe not? Well, surely you know whether or not you've been to school before, don't you?" Frightened by the newness of it all, and by the crisp manner and the rapid articulation of the stranger, Maybelle had to have some of the questions repeated. Meanwhile, Principal Langston was making mental notes. You see, he was fresh from a senior course in abnormal psychology, and he recalled that low intelligence was generally hereditary, in accordance with the law of Mendel, or at least that's what the book said. "She's got a very low IQ, he said to himself. Much like Case D in Van Topper's new book, Diagnosis of the Subnormal Child. He touched an electric button, and one of his assistants appeared. "Miss Cowan, here is a girl that's going to require some special case study. A problem child, you know. Please bring me one of those diagnostic tests." For more than an hour, the child underwent the ordeal. With clock-like precision, Langston hit her with questions, and with a watch in hand, he checked her answers. It was mainly the watch that proved to be Maybelle's undoing. She couldn't imagine why this man was in such a hurry. Most of the questions were simple enough, and she could have answered them if he hadn't kept his eye on the dial of the watch the whole time. Heck, nobody in Tucker's Cove ever asked questions that fast, or had to have answers so quickly. Cove folk answered slowly, because everybody knew that people who talk too soon often get in trouble by it, or at least the old-timer said. When the test was finally over, Langston and Miss Cowan went over the papers and they computed the score, while Maybelle and her father waited in the outer office. "Just as I anticipated," the principal declared finally. "Subnormal, that's all we can call her. No use of admitting her to school." "But Mr. Langston," the assistant began in mild protest, "she certainly doesn't look or talk like a feeble-minded child. Maybe the conditions weren't just right. She was painfully timid and self-conscious, as you noticed, and—" "Now, Miss Collin, this test is the last word of mental measurements. We can't let a kindly sentiment influence us in the face of science." "But Mr. Langston, shouldn't we give her a second chance? I can't bear to see the suffering that's going to be on that child's face when you tell her she can't come to school." "Now, Miss Cowan, a defective child like this is incapable of feeling disappointment or humiliation as a normal child would." Reluctantly, Miss Cowan yielded to the authority of her superior. She remained in the room when Maybelle was summoned. The girl listened to the verdict without a tear, without even a tremor in her voice, and she rose to go. "All right, sir. Paul said you'd know what was best. Of course, sir, I've wanted to come to school more than anything in the world. But if I can't—" "That's all right, youngster," Langston broke in with a laugh. "We can't all be scholars, you know. It takes all kinds of people in this world." "Yes, sir. That's what Paul says. He says there's other ways to go and live besides going to school, and I'll do my best to just try to quit wanting to go." Hurt beyond all weeping, Maybelle dragged her heavy feet and her heavier heart up the homeward road. Ike understood, and he strode beside her in speechless sympathy. When they reached the gate at home, he took her in his arms and carried her up the lower bordered path. It's all right, honey. Don't let that professor say that you're not as smart as anybody. We can get by without no school." "Indeed we can, Daddy. You did, and so I can. But I'm going to learn how to read by myself. Mama taught me some of the littlest words, and I'll learn a lot more. And someday, I'll read all her books to you." Now, there were many things in this world that Ike didn't know, and the greatest of those was Maybelle. From that day, she set herself with indomitable will to the staggering task of learning how to read without a teacher. Every day, between chores in the kitchen and yard, she would curl up in the armchair by the window with one of her mother's storybooks. Laboriously, she would puzzle out the words that Polly had shown to her. To this little stock of words, she slowly added a few others by association. They came with difficulty at first, but a bit more easily as the time went by. Every week she had more words, and such beautiful words they were, all lovely things, and lovely words most of all. They were food and drink to her hungering soul. Ike would sit by her side, smiling in dumb rapture as he listened. Gabby reading a book, he thought. It seemed unreal, impossible. He half suspected she wasn't really truly reading, just play like reading. That's probably what was likely, he thought. Why, not even a smart man's child could learn how to read without going to school or being taught their ABCs. Poor child, though. He wouldn't discourage her for the world. Let her think that she could read anyhow. The years came and went. The calves grew and fattened. Father and daughter lived, toiled, saved, and prospered. They enjoyed the friendship of their neighbors, and the old house was not without its share of guests. Best of all, though, were the long evenings when nobody came. Maybelle would read and reread her mother's books, and by now she had bought new ones of her own. Her daddy, Ike, had become a sponge and a responsive listener. By slow degrees, his slow mind had gained the power to understand the words that Maybelle read. With her help, he outgrew the childish fancies of the little primer books and soon thrilled to the tales of Arabian Nights and the adventures of Robinson Crusoe, to the colorful Iliad and the Odysseys of Homer. Books about history and travel and biography evoked grunts of wonder and chuckles of delight that lingered in his dreams and echoed in his memory on the grassy ranges as he worked in the fields. One day, the former professor, Noah Dilrod, and the principal, Adolphus Langston, were conversing at the Crossroads General Store when Ike and Maybelle loaded their wagon to depart after their weekly shopping trip. Professor Dilrod leaned over to the principal and he whispered, "There goes that idiot, Ike Gabby and his gal. I reckon you've heard of them." "Well, yes, I have. Some time ago. What a pathetic case. The girl is bright-looking enough, and she dresses neatly, and outwardly she seems like a normal child. But I gave her a careful test, and I found her to be a complete moron. Of course, I had to exclude her from school." "I don't blame you, Mr. Langston," agreed the ex-professor. "It's in the breed. Her daddy came to my school 20 years ago, and I shipped him out on the third day. Us school teachers, we can't afford to fool away our time on folks who ain't got no book sense." As Ike and Maybelle finished loading their wagon to travel back home, both the father and the daughter took one last look at the professors. There stood two men who had no idea of either intelligence or mountain folks, for they were literally the only two idiots in all of Tucker's Cove.